Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. The following episode is the first of two released this weekend about political figures from Africa. The other is about Eritrean President Isaias. This episode concerns arguably the most significant figure in the independent history of Sudan. Whilst never technically leading the northeast African country, Hassan al-Turabi influenced successive Sudanese regimes and was frequently referred to as the power behind the throne in the first 10 years of the leadership of President Omar al-Bashir. Turabi's role in slowly imposing Sharia law on the Sudanese people and instigating the 1989 coup that brought Bashir to power also made him one of the most successful Islamist politicians in the Muslim world. His quiet, bookish persona often disarmed commentators, contrasting so strongly, as it did, with Bashir's bullish regime. In the end, though, Turabi's ability to influence decisions from the shadows proved limited when faced with the military strength of Bashir, who ultimately shook off Turabi at the end of the 1990s. Turabi's story is a demonstration, perhaps, that proximity to power, rather than the direct possession of it, can only get you so far. Bashir's time in power was ultimately a terrible 30 years for Sudan, with the country experiencing two brutal civil wars and the division of the country between North and South in 2011. Even though Turabi left the stage before this, his role in the initial 1989 coup means that at least some of the blame must be apportioned to him, making him a worthy and interesting candidate for the podcast. His own philosophy also invites questions about the role Islamism plays across Northern Africa and the Middle East. My guest today is Willow Berridge, a lecturer in history at the University of Newcastle. Willow has written extensively on Sudanese history and Islamism, and her 2015 book Hassan al-Turabi, Islamist Politics and Democracy in Sudan, documents our subject's life and influence. We discuss the origins of Islamism in Sudan, Turabi's desire to stay hidden from view, and whether this helped or hindered him, his relationship with Osama bin Laden, who lived in Sudan for a period in the 1990s, and much more. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Hassan al-Turabi. Hi Willow, how are you?
Hey Tom, I'm lovely, thanks. How are you doing?
Very well. I've got a bit of a cold, but I'm all right.
Oh, it's that time of year, isn't it?
It is. I hope it's not COVID time of year.
Fingers
Willow,
crossed.
well, let's hope so. Willow, we are talking about Hassan al-Turabi today. He was the leader of Sudan's National Islamic Front. Turabi was born in 1931, and Sudan didn't become an independent country until 1956. It became obviously independent from the British Empire. Just to set things up a bit, what are the most important things to know about Sudan's colonial history, as far as they relate to Sudan's history post-independence?
Okay, well, first of all, Sudan has quite a peculiar colonial history in the sense that Sudan in the colonial era was formerly the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. It went through two phases of colonialism. In essence, there was the period of Turco-Egyptian colonialism in the 19th century, and then which was followed by a rebellion by the Mahdi, Muhammad Ahmad, in 1881, which chased the Egyptians out. And then in 1898, the British, having themselves informally colonized Egypt, reconquered, it was referred to as the Reconquest, they reconquered Sudan in alliance with in a kind of coerced alliance with the Egyptian government. So for that period between 1899 and 1956, Sudan was the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. So it was effectively the one condominium in the British Empire. So it has that quite peculiar history that it was never, in a sense, a formal British colony as such, but de facto in this unequal ruling partnership between the British and the Egyptians. The British dominated, and a lot of the institutions Turabi himself experienced were very anglicised colonial institutions, like Handub Secondary School, where he had his secondary education, often famously referred to as the Eton of Sudan, and then Gordon Memorial College, famously named after General Gordon, the British general in the British imperial worldview, who became a great martyr figure of the British Empire, fighting against the Mahdi in 1885.
It may be good to kind of pick up where you left off there with Turabi's education. Turabi was an Islamist. The northern part of Sudan is overwhelmingly Muslim. The south is kind of broadly Christian and animist. The country is obviously now separated into two countries, and in no small part due to religious differences. Islamism is obviously, put crudely, it's kind of the manifestation of Islam within politics and in all realms of public life. In the early independent Sudan, which al-Turabi was growing up in, of the 50s and the 60s, how important was Islam in public life, in political life?
Okay, so in the 1950s and the 1960s, the relationship between religion and politics had been set up by the colonial context. I'll put it that way. The government that had been overthrown, the state that had been overthrown by the colonial state, was the Mahadist state of Muhammad Ahmed, which was itself in its own way an expression of political Islam. And he did not maintain a distinction between the religious and the political spheres, at least in the formal sense. But of course, the British colonial state very much did. And the elite that led Sudan in the post-colonial era was very much trained in this Anglophone secular institution, Gordon Memorial College, which went on to become Khartoum University and went on to become the great generator of the incubator of the Sudanese elite of the 1940s right through to the 1980s and arguably still to the present day. And that was the kind of intellectual and political environment Turabi was familiar with. And a lot of his politics, I mean, in the 1960s, his movement was a very small movement. The Islamic Charter Front only got very few seats in the parliament of the 1960s and was confronted by parties that were willing to embrace the idea of an Islamic constitution to replace the secular or semi-secular constitution negotiated at the end of independence, which was really only a transitional constitution. But his party and his Islamist ideology that wanted to efface the distinction between the secular and the religious realms did not have that much support in the 1960s.
There's little doubting that he was very intelligent and very bookish. He was an academic, really, as much as he was ever a political figure. He studied in Britain and in France, at La Sorbonne in Paris. He had a brilliant level of written and spoken English and French. Why do you think he became an Islamist? You know, why did he see Islamic government, not just Islam, but Islamic government, as the solution to challenges faced by the Sudanese people? And what were those challenges?
A few questions there. So why did he become an Islamist? I think he was someone who defined himself politically in opposition to the Sudan Communist Party. So the Sudan Communist Party was one of the great forces in the Sudanese political and intellectual elite at the time. And his education in the 1940s, in that era, you either embraced Marxism and the kind of nationalist anti-colonial Marxism of that era, or in the Sudanese context, you embraced this alternative politics rooted in Islam, which sought to engage with some of the Marxist arguments and rhetoric and anti-colonial praxis, but frame it through an Islamic worldview. And Turabi, I think it's often been said that he's someone who, particularly because he was from a famous Sufi family in Sudan. One of his 17th century ancestors was a famous Sufi saint in Sudan. So he had that kind of religious heritage, that he was somebody who could, and he had sufficient upbringing as well in fiqh and Islamic jurisprudence, particularly because his father was a Qadi, an Islamic justice, that he had that knowledge. He had that knowledge of the nationalist and liberationist and anti-colonial student politics he was very familiar with from university. But he also had sufficient understanding of the classic religious sciences and jurisprudences that he could articulate it in an Islamic framework. And in that era, that was in a way what Islamist politics was.
So in a sense, you think Islamism was a proxy for something else, perhaps?
I guess. I mean, I'm getting into a broader discussion about Islamist politics here. So it's like one of the cliches of commentary on Islamism is often that Islamist ideology is really kind of Marxist-Leninist ideology that's being sold with Islamic window dressing, which is maybe not like entirely the case. I mean, it's true and it's not. I know a lot of his Sudanese critics will say that he distorted Marxist-Leninist ideology to his own purpose and kind of recast it in his own framework. I think, as well, a lot of his Islamist politics is about the specific context of Sudan as well, the specific cultural context of Sudan. He's someone whose heritage is in the central riverine areas of Sudan that have dominated and exploited the peripheries of Sudan, particularly Darfur, southern Kordofan, the recently seceded region of southern Sudan, which became the independent country of South Sudan. A lot of his politics is about entrenching the dominance of those regions.
He became the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood in the early 60s. Obviously, this organisation, to some degree, wanted to proselytise people in Sudan. I think from what you've said, it doesn't sound as if that went very well. At least in the 60s. There was a military coup in Sudan in 1969. Jafar Numeri was an army officer, became leader of Sudan and actually jailed Turabi for a while, presumably because he feared his fairly potent message. But he then also released Turabi from prison in 1977. Why did he do that? Was it because Turabi's kind of Islamist message had reached a greater level of potency by the 70s? So
I guess 1969, apparently Turabi was the first person that Numeri jailed in 1969. It was also ironically one of his old schoolmates from his year in Hantub College. I think what happens in that Numeri period is Numeri's coup was initially a very left-leaning coup. He came to power with the support of certain factions of the Sudan Communist Party and Arab socialists as well. And he was initially leading a quite radical regime. That quickly changed. He fell out with the Sudanese left, famously fell out with the Sudanese Communist Party in 1970. Then in 1971, he executed the leader of the Sudan Communist Party. And his regime became slowly more and more conservative. So part of it was that regime's distancing of itself from the left. It's true as well that the Islamists, in alliance with some of the more conservative parties in Sudan that had a Sufi basis, the Umar Party, the Democratic Unionist Party, they attempted a coup against Numeri in 1976, came fairly close to succeeding, so Numeri staged this reconciliation. And in 1977, Turabi was still a relatively, and the Islamists, they were still a relatively minor political force in Sudan at that time. But what really happened was they used that period, the period of the reconciliation with Nimeri's regime, and the years after that, to really entrench themselves in the military. They also established a major presence in the banking sector, using a lot of Gulf capital. And
so it was almost a sort of long march through the institutions in Sudan then.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Particularly that reconciliation with Nimeri in 1977 really helped Turabi and the Islamists entrench themselves in the core power centres in Sudan.
If we look at another major event of the late 1970s that I think perhaps is interesting here, the sort of reconciliation that you've just talked about in 76, 77 happened just before the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And this was obviously, in many ways, perhaps actually an ideologically fairly nondescript revolution to begin with, but it's gained since a reputation of being an Islamic revolution. That perhaps actually chimes slightly with what you've said about some of Turabi's ideas in the sense that he was perhaps less Islamist, or his ideas were quite complicated in the 60s and 70s. What did Turabi write about the revolution in Iran? Do you think it was a particularly important event for him?
I think it was. It's interesting. A lot of the anti-Turabi crowds at the time, when Turabi was Nimeri's Attorney General and when he was going through his process of Islamizing the legal system in Sudan in the early 1980s, after the Iranian Revolution, one of the slogans on the street was "No to the Khomeini of Sudan." Turabi himself had quite an ambivalent relationship with the Iranian Revolution. On one level, when he took power in the 1990s, he wanted, and he set up his Popular Arab and Islamic Conference as a kind of challenge to the West. He really wanted to bring the Iranians on board. At the other time, he was quite clear that he didn't see a similar the Islamic State as he envisioned it in Sudan happening in the same way as in Iran. He didn't envisage what he called Council of Guardians, like Khomeini's Council of Guardians. He said he didn't want a system like the rule of the jurisprudence that they had in Iran. He didn't identify himself in the same way, although many of his opponents actually accused him of acting like that de facto.
When you look at the rest of the 1980s, when Turabi's vision for an Islamic society was beginning to take shape, as you said, through his role as Nimeri's Attorney General, Nimeri was removed in a coup in 1985. Please, go ahead.
Technically, it was a popular uprising, which led to the military to intervene, declared they were siding with the people, and initiate a one-year transition, which did lead to 3 years of parliamentary democracy. So technically, he was moved by the uprising, although the military technically intervened by it to say he was
maybe
going.
if I change my question slightly, then Nimeri was removed from power in 1985, or he left power in 1985. In terms of the sort of Islamist point of view that somebody like Turabi was coming from, was the government that came after? Was it, do you think, a better fit for his politics or a worse one?
The government that came after was a better fit for his politics. Well, I mean, in the long run, he overthrew it. So I guess and you could argue, I mean, most of Turabi's opponents would say the reason he ultimately overthrew the parliamentary democracy was because he couldn't achieve his political objectives through democratic means. He did. I mean, ironically, he participated in that government. There was a kind of political alliance when it came to the parliamentary elections in 1986. All the other parties agreed when he stood in a seat called al-Jabara in Khartoum. They all agreed that they'd stand one candidate against him, a bit like people were talking about with Boris Johnson in the last election here. They agreed to stand one candidate against him. So he didn't actually win a seat in 1986 in the parliamentary elections. So that didn't work out well for him. The National Islamic Front did better than the Islamic Charter Front in the 1960s, but they still got something like a sixth of the seats, a big chunk of which were in seats set aside only for graduate voters. So they didn't become the dominant force in the parliament. They tried to influence the two other major parties, which were nationalist parties with a kind of Sufi grounding, the Umma and the Democratic Unionist Party. They tried to push them to introduce a law code based on Turabi's understanding of what Sharia law was, and failed. And once Parliament, Turabi became Attorney General and tried to get his own version of the criminal code through based on his own interpretation of Sharia. That didn't work because the representatives of the other parties didn't vote to pass it. Turabi was frustrated. He was also frustrated that the other parties were going to sign a peace deal with the Sudan People's Liberation Army, which was the main protagonist in the war between the Khartoum government and the rebels in southern Sudan. And in 1989, Turabi and the National Islamic Front staged a coup in alliance with Omar al-Bashir.
Yes, indeed. And Omar al-Bashir then was president of Sudan for the next 30 years. I think this is probably fair to say that the relationship between Bashir and Turabi was kind of, it was maybe reciprocally transactional. Bashir was using a religious figure to gain a certain respectability, and Turabi was using the politician Bashir to advance his own ideals. I'd encourage people to go and listen to interviews of Turabi, because if nothing else, he was a very interesting speaker, and he had a brilliant charisma, which comes across very, really electric smile and all the rest. Do you think did he outwit Bashir? Do you think?
I mean, obviously, on an intellectual level, Turabi saw himself as superior to a lot of people, including people like Hosni Mubarak and Bashir and these soldiers. Did he outwit him? Well, I mean, technically, it was Bashir that outmaneuvered Turabi in the end in 1999 when Turabi had to leave the government. And Turabi didn't realise how many of his own people in what was still by a lot of people called the National Islamic Front, although it was formally dissolved in 1989. Turabi didn't realise how many of them would end up siding with Bashir in the split of 1989. And his argument was always that, they were seduced by money and power, which, of course, Turabi had always seen as a means to an end. And it turned out that a lot of his supporters ended up seeing it as an end in itself. So I guess, Bashir at first Turabi would have known very little about Bashir as at first. He would have just seen him as a general that he could use as his proxy. He'd been one of the military officers cultivated by the National Islamic Front in the 1980s when it was going what you described as its long march through the institutions. When that was happening, he was one of those generals that had been cultivated. And Turabi in the early 1990s would have thought very little of him. He'd have just looked at him as some pawn he could use. But eventually, Bashir really managed to establish himself as a major player amongst the military, amongst the intelligence services, and he essentially outmaneuvered Turabi.
If we look at that long march through the institutions, the 1989 coup essentially meant that Turabi had, much greater. He was in a much better position to kind of further that revolution. Turabi obviously wanted Sudanese people to think in a certain way about the world and about themselves, and he wanted them to do that based on the Quran. If you look at how many people were enamored, let's say, or converted to the idea of having an Islamist government in Sudan in the 80s and 90s, do you think Turabi can be seen as having been successful in doing that? Do you think that long march through the institutions actually permeated through society very much?
I mean, this is the classic. People often refer to as that major question in the region: how much people actually invest in Islamist politics. I mean, obviously, what you've seen in Sudan recently is a major movement of mass civil disobedience against the kind of post-Turabi regime, which technically was not Turabi's own regime because he departed it in 1999, but it still had much of a legacy of his Islamist politics in it and the institutions that emerged in his era. I think what he was very successful at was cultivating a consensus within the most mobile and determined factors of the Sudanese intelligentsia and political elite in the 1980s in particular, in favour of a shift in an Islamist direction, and in making Islamist politics a kind of entry route for people from certain regions of Sudan, particularly parts of eastern Sudan, and famously, of course, a huge number of his supporters in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s came from Darfur and the Darfuri elites. I mean, and Islamist politics at that time became a way that people from the marginalised parts of Sudan, more Darfur than South Kordofan or southern Sudan, could get access to the power centres.
That you see as a good thing?
Do I see that as a good thing?
Yeah.
Oh, well, this is the thing about historians making moral judgments. But of course, I mean, Turabi's politics, he saw his movement as like a version of the Muslim Brotherhood. He never wanted his own movement to be called the Muslim Brotherhood, incidentally, because he thought it wouldn't work in a Sudanese and African context. And one of his successes was developing that support base in Darfur. Of course, Turabi's own regime went on to pursue devastating policies in Darfur and elsewhere, because a lot of his politics was about co-opting a certain cohort of the Darfuri intelligentsia, whilst pursuing policies, particularly in southern Sudan in the era, but which would kind of continue into Darfur in the 2000s once Turabi had gone, which were just economically very destructive and rooted in this kind of slash and burn economics and militia politics.
You mentioned earlier that this kind of central belt of Sudan has traditionally had the kind of whip hand over the rest of the country, economically and politically. Do you think Turabi was actually interested in changing that at all? If you look at the rest of his time in power, the wars that continued under his period in Darfur and southern Sudan.
This gets you into this interesting, philosophical question about to what extent can historians determine what historical actors really wanted or believed, and to what extent did they know themselves? I think Turabi, in his own way, saw his politics as a means to unify Sudan. He saw Islam as a means to unify Sudan. He said that the majority of the Sudanese population, this was the case even before South Sudan seceded, are Muslim, whereas the majority of the Sudanese population do not identify as Arab. And his argument was that therefore we have to base our politics around Islam, and that will be the unifying force. And he made a big thing. His party made a big thing just immediately before the secession of South Sudan, in the elections before the secession of South Sudan, of putting forward a South Sudanese member of his party, which was then the Popular Congress Party, as the presidential candidate in Sudan, as a unifying figure. It didn't work out, partly because the South Sudanese population was always going to vote for secession, and partly because those elections were quite heavily manipulated. But in his own way, he had his ideals, which he saw as potentially unifying Sudan. It's just a great majority of the Sudanese population didn't tend to see eye to eye with those ideals, and I guess that's why he had to take power by force.
If you think about Sudan's relationship with its neighbours and with the wider world in the post-1989 era, in which Turabi was the dominant political figure, what sort of reputation did he garner?
I think at the start of my book, I quoted all kinds of kind of insults that various political figures from the 1990s hurled at Turabi, and like from various like international diplomats to Osama bin Laden also ended up loathing Turabi. I think a lot of his international reputation was as a maverick. I think even bin Laden saw him that way. And I guess a lot of the frustration with Turabi internationally was that he couldn't be pinned down. He always insisted that he didn't run the Sudanese regime, which technically he never did. Bashir was the president throughout the 1990s. Turabi never had any formal role in the government until he became Speaker of Parliament in 1996. It was just that there was this de facto parallel leadership structure in which everybody listened to Turabi, and Turabi was de facto the dominant force, at least through the 1990s. So a lot of that led to this international reputation that Turabi had as a complete maverick who was completely manipulating all of his opponents. The whole idea of the 1989 coup being staged as a standard military coup, which wasn't Islamist in any way, just to fool the Egyptians into thinking that they shouldn't be worried about the coup in 1989.
I mean, the coup in that sense is pretty remarkable because, you know, very few countries sort of go through these or went through in that era these kind of, you know, a real sort of political conversion to Islamism. Other than Iran, really, Sudan is probably the only one, but it went through in this kind of very salami sliced, slow way. You mentioned obviously that Bashir, the sort of de facto president, gained this separate political identity and ultimately was able to shake Turabi off. Why do you think he managed to do that? And do you think it had anything to do with the international reputation?
I think a lot of it was to do with, I mean, Turabi's whole way of enacting political change was he fell into the classic trap that so many in the Sudanese elite fell into, which was trying to effect change top down through military alliances. And which, I mean, many people in his own movement criticized him for putting political ambition before long-term structural social transformation. I mean, the Sudanese Islamic movement had a set of internal debates that were very similar to the communists, the Marxists in Sudan. It was, do we try and like gradually educate and transform society in the long run to be more in line with our way of religious thinking, or do we capture the state, to use the state to transform society? And of course, Turabi's tactic in the end was to capture the state. But in the end, the state, as represented by Bashir, the intelligence services, the state captured him. So it didn't work out as he wanted, but did a lot of damage on the way.
So, in despite of the sort of rarity and remarkable nature of the 89 coup and the kind of Islamization, the top-down Islamization, do you really, in the end, do you view Turabi as a very successful figure?
Of course, I guess successful is always like contingent, isn't it, on various like ways of quantifying success.
In terms of somebody who saw their own aims implemented.
Okay, in terms of who saw their own aims implemented, I mean, technically, he was the first person to establish, at least at the nominal level, an Islamist regime in anywhere in the Sunni Muslim world, because of course Iran was Shia, and he achieved that in 1989. In terms of the practicalities of the project of establishing an Islamic State and all the mechanisms of an Islamic State and acquiring broad popular consent for it, he manifestly failed, insofar as A, he was kicked out of power himself in 1999. His state was never legitimized by any genuinely democratic election. All the elections post-Turabi were rigged. And of course, the regime he created, albeit that it kicked him out in 1999, that regime was toppled by popular uprising and mass civil disobedience in 2019. Evidently, his state was transformative. The economic system, the legal system in Sudan is fundamentally different in Sudan today because of his politics.
You've mentioned the events of 1999 a couple of times when Turabi's influence was severely curtailed by Bashir. What was the straw that broke the camel's back there?
The straw that broke the camel's back was Turabi's efforts to bring in legislation to Sudan's National Assembly that would have increased the power of state governors. Now, the context for this was that a lot of Turabi's supporters were in the regions. Turabi, as I said earlier, had made it part of his political strategy to expand the Islamic movement, drawing on particular support in Darfur particularly, but the regions generally. So when there was a power struggle in the Islamic movement in the 1990s between Bashir's supporters and Turabi's supporters, it kind of took on this kind of regional line between Turabi's supporters in Darfur particularly, but also to some extent in eastern Sudan and the other regions, and Bashir's supporters who wanted to maintain the Islamic movement's kind of historic strength, empowering the riverine centre of Sudan and Arab ideology. So that was the power struggle. Another part of the context was the year before. A number of members of the Islamic movement, kind of with the de facto backing of Bashir, had introduced a memorandum called, famously referred to as the Memorandum of the Ten, which had sought to curtail Turabi's powers within the National Assembly. And that was taken as more broadly as an attack on his influence within the Islamic movement. And the subsequent falling out in 1999 was a result of the political manoeuvring subsequent to that.
He was very often referred to as the power behind the throne for Bashir in the 1990s. If you look at that decade, when nominally the person in power was Bashir, he was obviously a military man, but you then had this considerable influence from Turabi. Do you think that the biggest lesson you can draw from Turabi's time in power in a way is that there's actually a limit to being behind the throne rather than on it?
Yeah, I think there is. And I think that's I think that's kind of what I argued in my book at points. Because I mean the original kind of stratagem of Turabi was he wanted all the benefits of being in power, but none of the drawbacks in terms of the international attention he would accrue. He wanted to be able to do all the work developing his idea of what an Islamic State was, and it developing the international networks that came with the Popular Arab and Islamic Conference, which was his project between 1991 and 1995, drawing all these Islamist and militant Islamist groups to Khartoum. So he wanted all the ability that came to access, all the power that came from access to the core power centres in Khartoum, but none of the drawbacks. But of course, his problem was that when you have this idea of power that the Islamic State is preempted by a military vanguard, soon the military vanguard just becomes the defining logic of power in its own right.
Yes.
That's what happened in Sudan.
Yeah, I suppose it becomes self-justifying to the point where actually it destroys the person that is instigating it. In terms of ideology, as you put it, Turabi was trying to use Islam to unite this very ethnically diverse country. Did Bashir break from Turabi's policies after 1999? Was this an ideological change of direction, rather than solely a personal one?
I think to some extent it was. I don't want to make Turabi's own ideology appear benign, because of course when Turabi was in power, de facto in power, the regime was still pursuing a war in southern Sudan, which led to devastating loss of life. The regime pursued a genocidal campaign in the Nuba Mountains, which Turabi, if he didn't directly support, at least overlooked. But what really happened after Turabi left, of course, you had the outbreak of the Darfur conflict in 2003, and some of the people who fought on the rebel side in the Darfur conflict were Turabi's own supporters, particularly in a movement called the Justice and Equality Movement in Darfur. If they weren't his supporters at the time, a lot of them were his former supporters, and his own party, formed after the split, the Popular Congress Party, maintained a lot of kind of informal links with one of the Darfur rebel movements, at least the Justice and Equality Movement. And in the wake of Turabi going, that kind of vision of Islamic African identity trumping the identity of the riverine centre or Arabness in Sudan, to the extent it had ever genuinely been pursued under Turabi, was replaced by a much more ethnocentric Arabist riverine vision associated with Bashir and what went on to become the National Congress Party.
Bin Laden's name came up earlier in our conversation.
Yeah.
Bin Laden, of course, lived in Khartoum for a period in the 1990s. The US frequently accused Sudan of harbouring Islamic terrorists at that time. Indeed, the Clinton administration bombed a pharmaceutical site in Khartoum in 1996 because it thought it was being used to supply al-Qaeda with nerve agents. Obviously, bin Laden went on to orchestrate the 9/11 attacks, among others. Given he lived in Sudan for a period when Turabi was in charge of it, can you lay much blame at Turabi's door for al-Qaeda's crimes? If you were to draw up a list of the 100 people most responsible for 9/11, for the embassy bombings that took place in East Africa in 1998, would Turabi be on it?
I guess he would. I don't think he'd be right at the top, but he'd be on it. When I spoke to him myself, what he said to me, and in fairness, he said this to other people as well, is that bin Laden was always in Sudan as a businessman. He always says he was only here as a businessman. When I taught as a volunteer in Kassala, people reminded me he was in Kassala running watermelon farms in eastern Sudan. So he had his business projects, but obviously at the same time, parallel to those that were his Islamist militant projects. And technically, there was no official recognition of al-Qaeda when bin Laden was in Sudan. It wasn't, although Turabi's Popular Arab and Islamic Conference had hosted all kinds of militant groups, like several of the Palestinian militant factions, alongside the other Islamist groups. Al-Qaeda was never recognized as a faction within Turabi's Popular Arab and Islamic Conference. It was always... He said to me at the time when I met him, he said, "Oh, bin Laden never appeared on the television. He was only ever here as a businessman. We didn't make a big thing of him being here." But of course, Al-Qaeda was operating as Al-Qaeda at that time. And of course, the East African embassy bombings happened after he left Sudan and after he went to Afghanistan. But of course, partly the links he developed within East Africa dated back to that time in Sudan. I don't think Turabi as such, I mean, he didn't directly command bin Laden or exactly, as far as we know, he didn't directly plan any terrorist operations with him. But obviously he gave bin Laden a place in Sudan at the time where he'd fallen out with the government in Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of the Gulf War. And Turabi was very clear on the position he was taking on the Gulf War, the first Gulf War in 1991. So, yeah, he facilitated his presence and his activities in Khartoum without being the actual mastermind of those activities, I think is how you could put it.
Bashir went on to serve without Turabi until 2019. You've mentioned the wars in South Sudan and in Darfur, which raged for much of those 2 decades.
Yeah.
Turabi died in 2016. Did he ever express regret later in his life that he had helped Bashir into power? Obviously, Bashir for Turabi initially was entirely instrumental in importance. He was his pawn to power for himself. But later, Bashir obviously developed this life of his own. And I think most people would have seen it as a pretty unpleasant life of its own.
I mean, Turabi did actually formally apologise. He did, I think, what did he say? I mean, one quote, he said it's letting Bashir into power is a mistake for which we'll never forgive ourselves. And to some extent, his party, the Popular Congress Party, for instance, they developed quite close ties with Rashid al-Ghannouchi in Tunisia, and the Al-Nahda movement, which was a movement which had only ever sought power and achieved power by democratic means, and his party started reanalyzing what it had done and the means it had achieved to power. I think the problem for Turabi was, by that point, his political credibility was so damaged by what he's done. I mean, the majority of the population wouldn't credit him. I mean, he lost a lot of his credibility when he came out of power, and what he said was he admitted that he'd effectively organised 1989 in the 1989 coup, and that he'd said to his arrangement with Bashir had been, you go to the palace, I'll go to the prison, because he'd been in prison for the first year when Bashir had been in power. Informally, he'd been put in prison to make it appear he wasn't behind it. It was another part of the grand manoeuvre. So when he confessed that, he lost a lot of his credibility.
Do you think then, Willow, that Bashir is the bigger villain of the two in modern Sudanese history?
I don't know. I think, conversations I've had with people in Sudan, part of it depends where in Sudan you hail from, and one perspective is that Turabi is so hated by a lot of people in Sudan just because he had the political vision and the kind of political Machiavellianism. And there's often no other word for Turabi. I think bin Laden himself described Turabi as a Machiavelli. I think because he had that kind of, it was his kind of vision and Machiavellianism that created the 1989 coup. Whereas I think a lot of people do just see Bashir as another soldier, and there have been a lot of soldiers in power in Sudan's history, and they've done some very bad things. But I think Turabi's ego as well was why sometimes people in Sudan will lay blame at his door more than Bashir's.
Because he was more remarkable, really.
Because he was more remarkable in a way, yeah.
Bashir himself was overthrown in 2019. You said earlier that in part there was a degree of grassroots reaction against his government.
Oh, yeah.
Which is interesting, given that so much of what we've discussed today has been top-down imposition of ideas and policies. Are you hopeful for the future of Sudan now? Obviously, it's split in two as well, which is something we haven't mentioned. But how do you feel about the decades ahead?
I think there's a very different political dynamic now. And in some ways, there's a lot more hope in Sudan than there was in the last 20 years, just because of how mobilized the young population is, how people aren't afraid anymore, how people are able to go on the streets constantly and challenge the current set of quote-unquote transitional military rulers. So in that sense, there's hope. But obviously things have taken a step back in Sudan in the last year, because there was supposed to be a transition from Bashir's regime, but the military, including Abdel Fattah Burhan, who was just very unfortunately invited to Queen Elizabeth's funeral, which was not the best decision by HMG in my opinion, but he was very unfortunately invited to Queen Elizabeth's funeral. Him and his fellow military quote-unquote transitional leaders basically threw the civilians out of the transitional government last year, and are ruling in effect by themselves at the moment, with the nominal aim of bringing about elections soon. So it's not as good a situation as it was immediately in the aftermath of Bashir's fall. But at the same time, you have a population that is very mobilized, does not want any form of military rule anymore, and is expressing it in a much more organized and much more confident way than it was in Bashir's time.
To return to Turabi and to Islamism, just to finish, in this new era, the post-Bashir era, if Islamists were to make a return to power, would it be in a sort of top-down coup of the sort that Turabi orchestrated in 89, or would it be more like what he was trying to do in the 1970s, sort of slowly taking over the institutions?
I don't think it'd be the same type of Islamist coup. Insofar as the NCP itself, the kind of legacy NCP, still has so much influence in the core power centres, the military, the businesses, that it almost wouldn't need a coup to re-establish itself there. So it doesn't exactly need to go through another long march with the institutions, because it's already there. I think in terms of capturing student and elite worldviews, which is what Turabi was doing in the 70s, I think they'd struggle in the same way, because the ideology has been so discredited to an extent. And I think rather than the kind of global revolutionary Islamism that Turabi envisaged, I don't think you'd see that again. I think you'd see a much more conservative, reactionary. Of course, the original movement was conservative and reactionary in many ways as well. But I think it would be a more narrow, conservative, reactionary movement that would probably rely on the existing strength of the legacy National Congress Party in the core centres of power, like the military and the core business centres.
Willow, thank you very much. That was a really good conversation. If people want to find your work, what you've written about Turabi or just more generally about Sudan, where can you direct them to?
Oh, where can I guess there's my Twitter profile, Wilberry85, at Wilberry85. The book on Turabi is Hassan al-Turabi, Islamist Politics and Democracy in Sudan. I originally published a book in 2015 on Sudan's first two civilian uprisings, which was called Khartoum Springs, Civil Uprisings in Modern Sudan. Recently co-published a book with Justin Lynch, Rajar Makui, and Alex Dewell, entitled Sudan's Unfinished Democracy. You'll see them all on my university staff profile.
And it's in Newcastle. Yeah.
At Newcastle University.
Yeah. Thank you, Willow. Cheers.
Okay. Thanks so much, Tom.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, so you never miss new content.